usually that means you're somehow dipping the rod. So if I were to do a single spey or a switch cast and lift first and then dip my rod, you can see the anchor tends to crash more. Okay, and that was a subtle one. But if I really dip it like that, and that calls from lifting too fast and then also dipping too hard. So what happens is I send my line up into the air, and then as I sweep back, you know, it's all physics. Once the line is moving in a certain direction, like it goes up like this, it starts to come down, momentum carries it back down. So you gotta stay smooth. The key here is stay smooth. Lift, bring the rod down, up, and out. Lift, down, up, and out. All right, so any questions on any of that so far? The other thing is, we talked about before too, remember the, if you're too steep, you're gonna have a skipping anchor, and you're gonna see your forward cast coming down. So if you're like this, you're gonna go like this. You wanna keep your backstroke level, and then up and out. Let's briefly talk about the forward stroke. Okay, we talked about where we stop the rod, we sweep, we bring the rod up. From here, I want to stroke forward. And most common mistake on a forward stroke is rolling the rod tip over. Okay, where the rod is just arcing from a low position. What happens is most people come back flat or whatever, and they roll the rod over. They start in a low position. You got to get the rod tip up, and you have to track the rod flat. When I was a kid, my friend had an apple tree in his yard, and his dad used to build rods, so his dad had blanks in the garage. We used to take the blanks, and we'd take the apples, and we'd shove the apples on the blanks, and we'd launch them at the neighbor's house. And if you think about doing that, okay, as I come forward, if I want to take the apple off that blank, I want to drive that apple flat, and I want to keep the apple back as long as possible. The last thing to come forward is the apple, okay? Back, back, back. I haven't brought the rod tip. The last thing to come forward is the apple and the rod tip. Last thing to come forward. Same thing on the backstroke. When I go to do my back cast, you can pretend there's an apple on there. I want to leave the rod out front, the rod tip out front as long as possible. The rod can only load, and I'm going to go back to the forward stroke here in a second. I want to brief on this. The rod can only load when it's pointing in the direction of the line. Okay, or if it's either perpendicular or out in front in the direction of the line. Once the rod is crossed perpendicular to the line, you really can't load the rod anymore. So you want to keep the rod out in front. You want to keep the rod out in front as long as possible. And we do that by transitioning. This hand transitions across, this elbow comes back. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm pulling the rod back. Lift, pull, up, and out. And as I come back, I'm flaring that rod tip. I'm pushing that rod tip out to 430 to keep me in line. Again, look at my anchor, my D-loop now. It's pointed directly opposite my target. So focus on keeping the rod tip out front as long as possible. That's how you're going to get the best bend in the rod. If you focus on doing that, look at how slow you can still execute a cast. And there's a couple things making that work. The fact that I'm accelerating, I'm gradually gaining speed, I'm keeping the line moving. Any kind of hesitation there, it's not going to work, okay? If I start my stroke a little fast and then hesitate, it's not really going to work well. Okay, my line's going to lose power, my D-loop's going to fall, my anchor's going to be left out in front a little bit. So smooth acceleration is key. On the forward stroke? Generally I do. I'm just doing that now, but if I were actually making a real nice cast, and we're going to talk about the forward stroke, you'd be stopping relatively high. And I'm going to go into that now actually. So let's go back to that forward stroke position. Here's my forward stroke position. That rod is tracking again like this, and I'm stopping, as he suggested, high. Okay, and what's going to happen here, if I take a ceiling, okay, this is my rod, this is my rod tip, my fingertip. I want to track along a ceiling. What I do is if I stop that rod high, that forms a tight loop. If I bring that hand down a little bit more, that's going to form a medium loop. If I bring that way down, that's going to form a big loop. So you always track your rod level to a high stop, keeping the rod tip back as long as possible, and then just turning it over at the end. Like this, lead with the elbow. Like in any sport, you play baseball, you want to lead with the elbow. You know, you want to leave the head of the bat back, and a good batter is going to, you know, stay back and then lead through the baseball. He's 0 for 20, he's anxious. What happens is he gets out in front and he ends up chopping at the ball. he's got nothing left in his stroke. Well, it's the same thing with this. If you bring that rod tip forward prematurely, you're not going to have anything left in your stroke. So if I come back and I get that rod out in front, I've got nothing left. I want to stay back and then send that line. So that's kind of how to execute a forward stroke. Again, rolling the rod tip would look like this. If I were to bring the rod tip over past the ceiling and then back down, that's bad. And that would look something like this. That's rolling the rod tip. We want to stabilize this, stabilize bottom hand, lift the rod tip up, accelerate and stop high. So I'm going to go through some casts here, and pretty much what I've showed you is going to work for all these different casts. So if I went, let's start with a single spey, okay? And the single spey is just like the switch cast we showed. The only difference is now I'm casting here. Where am I going to put my anchor? I'm going to put my anchor here now, right? And the key with the single spey is really hard for a lot of people to learn because they kind of get nervous about how am I going to set my anchor? You know, they tend not to bring the rod down. You need good acceleration for a single spey, and you need to get the rod tip down. So we bring the rod up, okay? Again, I'm controlling my hands. See this angle here? On all my casts, you want to control this angle as long as possible through your stroke. So as I stroke back, I'm going to control that angle. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm lifting, the rod tip's coming down, and I'm accelerating over my anchor. There's my anchor. You can see my D-loop is opposite where I'm trying to cast right now. That would be a good position for a forward stroke. A good sweep, a good anchor, and a good D-loop alignment for my forward stroke. Again, lift, come around, touch. Now a little low because I went a little slow showing you. So lift, just commit more to it. Sorry, buddy. So, like we talked about, now watch, now on this one my anchor is going to fly out because I'm keeping the rod too high. Very common single spey mistake is they're not bringing the rod down and your anchor is consistently going too high, too high, too high. That's what that's from. It's either that or you see a low anchor often because people are just overthinking it, and they're not accelerating the rod tip and you leave a low anchor like that. So the best way to get this cast to work is just think about what you're going to do before you do it and just commit to it. Just make it happen. Lift the rod, sweep, touch, and go. Lift, touch. I got my D-loop. You can see I lift my rod. By lifting the rod, I'm helping to suspend. I'm getting more on top of the cast, and I'm also suspending that D-loop momentarily to now allow me to go forward. A good, and like we talked about, I don't care if you single hand cast or double hand cast, it's very critical to keep your backstroke flat. If you really want to get a good, well-loaded rod, it's good to keep that rod low. By sending a low backstroke, okay, the lower the line is behind you, the more it can press and load on the rod. The higher the line is, the less it can load the rod. So it's good to have a flat back cast. And again, by keeping the rod low, you don't have to worry about the line hitting the water behind you. That's mostly from keeping the rod too high. By keeping the rod high, the line's coming down. When you go high, it's hard to go higher to keep the line going, you know, either level or on a little bit slightly upward angle. By going high, you're going to throw your line down every time. So, you know, if I were to do a single hand cast right now and I go high like this, you know, by the time the line loads, it's hitting the water. You know, granted, you can go high and you can stop it higher and that works. But with a spey cast, you really need to keep the rod low to make a good cast.